Hi, my name is Troy, and we're going to talk about minority youth and some of the problems that are afflicting this community. So basically, regardless of age, African Americans and Hispanics have higher victimization rates than whites. If you're a 15 to 17-year-old African American or Hispanic, you're about twice as likely to be the victim of a crime involving a weapon. And the odds of being a victim if you're 12 to 15 years old is about 36.8 out of 1,000 people. And if you're 16 to 19 years old, that's about 30.3 out of 1,000 people. And for 25 to 34-year-olds, it's about 21.5 out of 1,000. What this basically means is that the older you get, the smaller your chances are of being victimized. And although that is good for adults or anybody who's over 24, if you couple this statistic, it's definitely bad news for our youth. And if you couple the statistic with race, it's definitely a huge problem in our minority communities. So what I believe this stems from is social disorganization theory, which is essentially, it means that the lower quality of living a community faces has a direct influence on the crime in the area. It's merely a small part of the theory, as there have been a multitude of studies on the subject, and our understanding of social disorganization is progressing. It's still basically a huge problem in America. It does extend to the familial environment and how we're raised. So for some areas, the social disorganization of a neighborhood is definitely going to shape the lives of everybody who's living in it, and it can even determine the difference of if you are going to live your life behind bars or if you're going to retire somewhere, on a front porch, sunny and 75. So in 2010, about 4,828 young people ages 10 to 24 were victims of homicide, and that's an average of about 13 per day. So each and every day, 13 people between the ages of 10 to 24 are going to be victims of homicide. It's the second leading cause of death for young people from 15 to 24, and about 86% are male and 14% are female. About 82.8% of homicides victims age 10 to 24 years old was having to do with the firearm. So as far as juvenile arrest goes, juveniles counted for about 13.7% of all violent crime arrests and about 22.5% of all property crime arrests in 2010 alone. So these are some really disparaging statistics. So the book, The Color of Justice, talks about a story about a person named Lionel Tate. So in June 2001, Lionel Tate received a life in prison without the possibility of parole sentence at the age of 12. He was demonstrating a wrestling move on a 6-year-old family friend. He did get tried as an adult, but in 2003, his conviction was overturned on the basis that competency wasn't established in the initial trial. So he did have to plead guilty to second-degree murder, and he did receive time served. So he did get let out of prison in 2005. He also was placed on 1 year of house arrest. But in 2004. Well, in 2005, he was rearrested for robbing a pizza delivery man at gunpoint. He did get sentenced to 30 years for the gun charges in 2006, and they also sentenced him to 10 years for the actual robbery of the pizza man, and that was in 2008. And basically, it's really hard to argue that without the initial struggles, he may not. I mean, he was thrown in jail at 12. I can't imagine what that would do for you. He definitely learned things from other offenders in jail, and when he got out, he just went straight to offending. I wouldn't even say re-offending, because the first thing he initially did wasn't criminal in the first place. So there's been some really important Supreme Court rulings over the last few years. A big one is Roper versus Simmons. That one basically ruled that it's unconstitutional and against our 8th Amendment to sentence juveniles to death. It's just a disproportionate punishment for the young. They did also start bringing in the teenage brain, science on the teenage brain, into the courtroom, and so this really did help with a lot of these laws as well. And so there was also Graham versus Florida. So Roper banned the use of the death penalty, but they did leave life without the possibility of parole on the table. So in Graham versus Florida, the court banned the use of life without parole for juveniles not convicted of homicide. So basically, you have to be convicted of homicide, or it's unconstitutional to give you life without parole as a teenager. So in 2012, the Sentencing Project found some pretty interesting statistics. 79% of people sentenced to life in prison as juveniles had witnessed violence in their homes regularly. About 32% grew up in public housing. 40% had been enrolled in special education classes, which means that, we are dealing some sort of mental illness issues here as well. Fewer than half were attending school at the time, and 47% were physically abused. Also, out of these ones sentenced to life, 80% of girls reported histories of physical abuse, and 77%, which is only 3% under, reported histories of sexual abuse. And there's also a lot of racial disparities in this as well. So while 23.2% of juvenile arrests for murder involve an African American suspect of killing a white person, 42.4% of life without parole sentences are for an African American convicted of the crime. And white juvenile offenders were only about half as likely, so about 3.6% to receive the exact same sentence for killing an African American versus the other way around. So, that's really interesting as well. In a study that was trying to catalog the adverse childhood experiences that high-risk juvenile offenders face, basically they found that there was a low of 9% for family mental illnesses to a high of 82% of family violence. So out of the people that they talked to, 82% of high-risk juvenile offenders basically had family violence in the home. The percentage of youth who had an exposure to any ACE that did not have an exposure to any other race, 0 to 8%. And about 91 to 100% had an exposure to another one. So basically, it's the situation that's going on in the communities, in some disparaged communities, and in the home too, because this is all familial violence as well, for social disorganization theory, that's causing minority youths to basically just be at such a high risk than their counterpart, than anybody else really. So also, homicide is the leading cause of death for African Americans aged 10 to 24. Now that's insane. Say it again. Homicide is the leading cause of death for African Americans aged 10 to 24. The second leading cause of death for Hispanics of the same age. And homicide is the third leading cause of death for Native Americans the same age. Honestly, it shouldn't even be up there. It shouldn't even be in the top 10. In an ideal world, everybody would die of old age. You know what I mean? And not be murdered. So this is really disparaging. In 2014, almost half of African American deaths of 15 to 24-year-olds was homicide, compared to only 6.5% of white people, basically. So that's a difference of 50% to 6.5% for another race. So one of the things that's out there that's helping is the Minority Youth Violence Preventative Initiate. What this does is it's a public health model focusing on prevention of violence rather than the reaction to violence, to crime, the prevention of violent crime rather than the reaction to violent crime. It's a really good direction in the move for community-oriented policing, and it's backed and funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, and the United States Department of Justice. It basically comes down to social disorganization theory is largely prevalent in minority neighborhoods, and it starts in the household. Parents need to start being more involved with their kids' life. The teen brain is such a complex ball of emotions that it's ready to fire off at any time. And being surrounded by crime or seeing crime in your homes, occurring all the time is exactly where teenagers are learning their audacity for violence as well.